On Saturday, the South Boston Arts Association will hold an open poetry reading. High school students and adults are invited to read some of their own work or something by a favorite poet. The event's led by our guest, a writer and association board member, Dorothy Morris. Thank you very much for being with us, Dorothy.
Thank you for inviting me, Chris.
Talk about, I guess, poetry in your own life, because you got published after you retired, but your association with poetry, this goes way back to, I guess, when you were a kid in South Boston.
Well, when I first learned to read and write, I think 5 or 6, I wrote some poetry. And I wrote very good compositions for school, and I loved poetry. That was a very primary thing in my life because of the deep feelings and the emotions it arouses and the beauty of it, and the lyrical sound. Even though I'm not a good singer, I understand the rhythm and the music in poetry, and I went on to read a lot of poetry. In high school, I read a lot of the traditional English poets, and I'm not really up to date on more modern poets, too much of them. I loved that 18th century, 19th century, but I did not continue with poetry. I did other types of writing, which got high praise from my parents and the teachers. And I decided about the 8th grade I wanted to be a journalist. And in high school, senior year, I had a prominent role. I instituted a newspaper, and I think I was some officer there too, in a very small school in South Boston. And I got invited to the Associated Press up in New York. And Tyrone Power was there. Do you remember Tyrone Power?
A little bit before my time, but I do remember seeing him in some of those old black and white films. Yes.
And I'm not sure if Edward Murray.
Well, I want to go back to your family, because you mentioned the reaction to poems by your mother. How important was that for you?
Well, I was one of 8 children, so somehow I feel like that was a lot of competition. And my oldest brother died when he was 4. And so my sister Ian was the oldest, and Ian was always number 1. And I used to joke about being number 2. So this was my thing, to be able to write. And my mother loved to read. And my mother was a history teacher. She wasn't doing that while she was bringing us up. But both my parents were brilliant people, and so they admired this trait or this gift. But as I started to say, I was not able to continue with it. When I went to Simmons College, and I majored in communications. It was called the School of Publication then. And I went on to start a journalistic career. And in my mid-20s, I had a nervous breakdown, and that derailed any plans I had for journalism. I tried, but I had a hard time finding any job. And I eventually settled in with a financial company where I worked for 30 years. And I eventually was director of corporate libraries. And just as I started working at the BPL in college, and in addition to poetry, libraries are very important to me. So that was very good.
I got to ask you about, you mentioned you had a mental health challenge, and how did poetry help you with that?
Well, at the time, I wasn't able to do much. And I wasn't writing poetry then. And it would have been a good outlet, therapy, but I just was not able to do almost anything. And I really was in a world of my own, and I was fighting for my life, really, and my intelligence. And to jump ahead, I did other types of writing. I did freelance writing for newspapers and magazines. And for about in the 80s and 90s, while I was working, I did travel articles for the Quincy Patriot Ledger for about 13 years. And so I kept my hand in the writing, but I really didn't think about the poetry. But I had written one poem in the last few years before I retired, and through luck, on the hand of God, I wound up taking a course with Jack Canavan, who was a member of the South Boston Art Association, just to brush up. And he mentioned there was a South Boston Literary Gazette edited by Dave Conley, who is an anti-war veteran. He's a veteran, and he writes anti-war poetry, very well known. And I had one poem that I had written in the last several years, and it rhymed, but it didn't have the rhythm. And I never thought he'd publish it, and he published it. And that was the catalyst, and everything else fell into place after that. And I really think we have to talk about the hand of God, and I write about that. I write quite a bit of religious poetry, and one editor in South Boston described my poetry as a journey. My second book is 1,000 Miles, which details my journey with depression. But it has some humor, other things I do, and some religious. And he said it was a journey not only of life, but a spiritual journey.
Of course, reading your poems, you find this in places that are not explicitly religious. You find it walking around Castle Island.
Oh, yes. The first book was called God Lights His Candles, and it was based on meditative walks at Castle Island. And I have to tell you, when I became ill, it was 64, I think, nobody ever mentioned exercise. I didn't have sports in my life. I was at girls' school for 16 years. And I liked tennis, but there's no tennis courts in South Boston. That time, I roller skated. We swam. Swimming was a great thing. But not a lot of exercise. And let me see where I was going with this.
But you needed something else to engage you, I think, right?
Well,
you didn't have the sports going on, so you had to have something. Here was this, possibility in poetry.
Well, I think it was a way of expressing myself and my feelings. I think I had trouble being a teenager. And I went back to writing about my illness in the years after I retired. And I started writing about religious poetry too. And I think you asked about that. It's writing is therapy, but more it's an exciting thing for me to do. And Castle Island, that's when I got ill at 64, nobody mentioned exercise. And now they realize, especially running, any exertion gives you a high that's the same as the wires that go through the brain to deal with depression, a high. And exercise has really, it brought on the poetry. It brought on the poetry, plus the catalyst from Dave Conley that he published it. And I just said, I could do this. And I didn't have to worry anymore about a job or pleasing anybody except myself. And so that's what I've been doing.
This has been on news, and we're talking with Dorothy Morris from the South Boston Arts Association. Dorothy, I mean, one of the other things that get people into poetry is that they like it, and sometimes they don't have people they can talk about that with. So what's that? You go to this event, and you're in this room, and there are other people who like poetry too. How does that feel?
Well, I'll tell you, I can't give you the exact quote, but my sister-in-law, my family has been, I have a big family, and they have been very supportive. I haven't gotten the young people, the grandnieces and nephews, just once, but we don't really have children there. We are going to have Jack Canavan, I mentioned him as a writer from South Boston. His granddaughter read for us once. She must have been about 13 at the time. And he called and said she had written some more poetry, and I was delighted. She's very talented. And we do have some people, they do, I'm in the library. It's at the South Boston Library on Broadway, East Broadway. It's this Saturday at 1:30 to 3:30. And we have people that are poets. And I met most of these people through the South Boston Art Association, which is a group primarily focused on painting. But Dave Conley sort of has taken a step back for his own reasons. And so I have tried to take over some of that. I have a writers group, and I have this this semi-annual poetry reading, which we've been doing for about 5 years. But we do have some poets, and occasionally we've had a guest. We're very fortunate, Sam Cornish, who has been very
the Boston's first poet laureate.
Yeah. And he is another catalyst in my life and a savior. And he has helped me with the books, and he has been very encouraging, he and his wife. So I invited him to South Boston. I think he was a little bit leery, but he was overjoyed that with this reception, said he would come again. And we have the audience participate. And I was happy last spring, we have it in April for the poetry reading, we had it for the poetry month. Some of my sisters came because we didn't have as many people as usual to read, and they read a poem. So now they see other people doing it who are not poets. But what I mentioned before about my sister-in-law, she wrote me an email after it, and she said, she doesn't write poetry, but she said, it's so wonderful to sit there on an afternoon and just listen to the words and, feel comforted. And I really have a good group coming every time, and the library is not huge, but we fill most of the seats. And also a good point is the same people keep coming. And I have met three new poets who have been taking lessons at University of Mass. And they have come to read. And I would say they're all three very talented. So it's like a treasure hunt. It's enjoyable for me.
It can be infectious.
Yeah.
Dorothy, we should mention this is going to be, tell me the location and the time this is happening on Saturday.
Yes, it's this Saturday, October 14th at 1:30 to 3:30 at the South Boston Library. That's right up from L Street, near, between L and K. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Pretty close to Flood Square, right?
Oh, no. Oh. No, it's down near L Street, which was
glad
Summer
you
Street.
cut
Summer
that.
Street, yeah.
Right.
So if they come in, and I have to say this, if people come from afar, you're better off taking the team because parking is a terrible dilemma in South Boston.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Dorothy Morris from the South Boston Arts Association.